My name's Daver, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I made this storage cabinet. This is Daver Made. I first off have to say that this project was pretty challenging because it consisted of a lot of firsts in woodworking for me. The first thing I needed to do was break down this 4x8 sheet of birch plywood. This was what I was going to use to make the case portion of the storage cabinet. To make the most efficient cuts possible, I used a website called Cut List Optimizer. I went this route because the cost of lumber and plywood right now is insane, and I wanted to be as efficient and cost effective as possible. To break down the plywood, I'm using the Craig Ripcut Saw Edge Guide. I don't have a track saw, so this was the best way to break down this sheet. I marked out all of my cuts using a T-square and then put blue tape down to prevent any tear out. I also used blue tape to label each panel that I had cut. And then I cut each panel down to their final size using the table saw. The one thing to keep in mind when buying sheets of plywood from the big box store is that the factory edge isn't always square, and this presented some challenges later on in the build for me. To assemble the cabinet, I'm using the Joint Mate Doweling Jig by Milescraft. Now, this is the first time I'm using dowels to join something together outside using them for a tabletop glue up. In all honesty, this doweling jig was awesome. This thing made aligning the dowels and drilling the corresponding holes that they go with very easy. I found that when drilling the dowel holes, it was important for me to know which panels went together, so I numbered them corresponding to the dowels that I had inserted and the dowel holes that I had drilled referenced off of those dry fit dowels. I hope that makes sense. If it's confusing, just Google it or drop me a comment and I can answer your questions. The next step was a moment of truth, the dry fit. I purchased some right angle clamps off Amazon that were fairly inexpensive, and I did get a tip to check to make sure that these were actually square and 90 degrees before using them, and needless to say, they were, and they really help with this assembly of the case on this project. Now I was at the point of no return and had to live with the alignment of the dowels, and I glued up everything and made sure it was nice and tight. And during this process, I continuously tried to clean up the glue squeeze out so I wouldn't have to worry about it after the fact when I sanded everything down. And then I added as many clamps as I could and then let it sit overnight to dry. Once the case was dry, it was time to route out a 1/4-inch rabbet. This is where the back panel would rest. And I'm using a plunge router that was kindly lent to me by my dad. So thanks, Dad. Here it is. I told you I'd use it, and this is me using it. So enjoy this shot. Oh yeah. Now, the router left these rounded corners, and I could use a chisel to square them up, but I decided to measure the back panel and cut it with those rounded corners. It was cold and rainy this day, so I had to cut the back panel out on the floor in my shop. I'm using a 1/4-inch piece of poplar for the back panel, and I'm using a sheet of foam insulation to protect my floor when I cut the back panel out. Now, this is a 1/2-inch piece of foam insulation, and I would recommend getting an inch or more. Now, I didn't film it, but to round the corners out, I used a bandsaw, and then I finished rounding them out with a sander. Despite paying an arm and a leg for this sheet of plywood, there were a lot of holes and gaps in the edges that I needed to fill before putting edge banding on. I had some spackling on hand, and since I was going to be painting this, I thought it would be okay to use on the back of the case, and on the front, it was going to be hidden by edge banding anyways, so I didn't think it would matter. I've seen other YouTubers, such as the DIY Huntress, use wood filler, but I didn't have any wood filler, and the spackling said that it can be used with wood, so I figured why not try it. After sanding the edges down, I decided to drill in the shelf pins. I'm using a Craig shelf pin jig that I got as a Christmas present, and this was the first time I was able to use it. I have to say that this thing worked out awesomely. Is that a word? I don't know, but you know what I mean. This jig made it super easy to drill in the shelf pins, and what I did was I had the drill in reverse at first to kind of start the hole, and then I put it in the forward drive. That way I wouldn't tear out any of the holes. And it worked very nicely. Next, I made the shelves. I decided to use my old jointer jig and make the shelves out of it. Since I got a jointer, I no longer needed it, and since the price of lumber is so high, I thought I could save some money by doing this. I then added edge banding to the front of the shelves that would be visible, and this was the first time I ever used edge banding, so I figured I would try it on the shelves before I actually tried it on the cabinet case itself. And for the second shelf, I repeated the exact same steps. Now it was time to move on to the main cabinet portion and do the edge banding. Now, when researching this project, I referenced a video by the DIY Huntress on making something very similar, and she had done the edge banding before assembling, and I really wish I would have done this. However, you know, you live, you learn, and I did it after the fact and made it work. With the intention of making my life a little bit more convenient, I bought an edge band trimmer, and it was, okay, save your money. Then I sanded down any high spots left remaining. Once that was done, I added some shelf pins and test fit my shelves that I had just made. Check out that beautiful edge banding. Next, I turned my attention to the one thing that had been intimidating me the most, and that was the doors for the cabinet. I used a Craig concealed hinge jig to drill out the holes for the hinges. These doors were going to be inset with concealed hinges. This jig was super easy to use, and I was happy with how it turned out. I'm using Bloom hinges, and I have to say that they fit perfectly. Using this Craig jig couldn't be any easier. And no, I'm not sponsored by Craig. Next, I drilled the holes for where the handles would go, and I used a template that I picked up for $7 at my local big box store. I placed a piece of scrap plywood underneath the door to prevent some blowout when drilling through. I'm using a brad point drill bit, and that is so I can drill as straight as possible through the door. Once I finished drilling out the holes for the hardware, I began prepping for paint. I used mineral spirits to wipe everything down, and then I used some bonding primer. This bonding primer I used is very thick and should do a good job at hiding the grain of the birch plywood, which will make adding paint a little bit easier. To contrast the white paint, I left the inside of the cabinet unpainted and just used some shellac to finish it. For the top coat, I used white enamel paint, and I used a foam roller to apply it. I applied several coats, I think 3 in total. In my experience, enamel paint just feels better, looks better, and offers a good amount of protection. Once the paint was dry, I attached the hardware to the doors. Then it was time to install the doors to make sure that they fit properly. This is something that made me very nervous, as I had never done inset doors before. Once again, I referenced the DIY Huntress's YouTube channel, and I also referenced Fix This, Build That on how to place inset doors. They use playing cards as shims to hold up the doors in the right spot while you install them. Once the doors were attached, I added a scrap piece of walnut to act as a door stop. Now, I placed it incorrectly the first time, so I had to redo it. Once I was done attaching the doors, I then realized that one of the panels for the doors was slightly warped and not exactly straight and flat. While this was likely an error on my end, I decided to move forward. Now it was time to attach the back panel. I'm using Titebond Quick and Thick, and then I'm going to use a brad nailer to firmly attach it while the glue dries. I guess I could have clamped the back panel to the case portion, but I was getting a little bit impatient at this point. Some of the nails didn't go in all the way, so I had to hammer them in. Then to fill any gaps, I used caulk around the seams, and once the caulk dried, I painted the whole thing. Since this was going to be the back of the storage cabinet, I didn't really have any concerns about using caulk. And hey, I think it looks good. I mean, it's going to be in my dining room. Now it was time to make the base for the cabinet. I'm using Peruvian walnut that I found on sale at my local woodcraft store. After rough cutting the pieces down on my miter saw, I ran them through my jointer and then through the planer. I have to say that milling up rough lumber is one of my favorite parts of the process. Using some scrap plywood, I cut out a template for the legs, and then I traced them onto the walnut and cut them out using my miter saw. Now I was extremely careful, but I know this method isn't the safest, so I did not show how I did it, but use your imagination and be safe. Then I ripped down the pieces that would be the stretchers between the legs of the base on the table saw. Now that all my pieces were cut out, I could start assembling it. I marked out where I was going to drill some dowels, and I used my Miles Craft Joint Mate doweling jig for this part of the project. After a quick dry fit, I then moved on to the glue up. Due to the angle of the legs, I knew it was going to be challenging adding some clamps, so I took some offcuts which created a square surface, and this allowed me to attach some cabinet clamps to the end of the legs. For the cross pieces of the base, I was going to use pocket screws to attach them to the front and the back part of the base. No one will see them, so I didn't think it really mattered much. Then I ran the front and back portions of the base through my router, doing a slight roundover for aesthetic purposes. In the end, I think this looked pretty good, and it was a nice touch. Then I proceeded to sand through the grits by hand, and this was so I didn't affect any of the roundovers using a power sander. Then I attached the base pieces to each other, and I used some pocket screws and glue. Now that the base was assembled, it was time to add finish. I'm using Walrus Oil's furniture finish, and this is a penetrating oil finish. Walrus Oil's not a sponsor, I just like their products. I think this really makes the grain pop and brings out that nice chocolatey color of the Peruvian walnut. The last thing I needed to do was attach the base to the case portion of the storage cabinet itself. I'm using these figure 8 fasteners which allow for wood movement during seasonal changes, which in Ohio, we have a lot. To actually attach the base to the cabinet portion, I had to flip the case upside down, which made me a little bit nervous because I was by myself, but all was good. I used a center hole punch for the hole locations, and then drilled out some pilot holes and inserted the screws by hand. Then I flipped it back over very carefully, and that was it. It was ready to be moved inside. As I mentioned previously in this video, this was a lot of firsts for me, and it was a challenge, but I learned a lot, and I'm very proud of how it turned out. I hope you learned something too, and even if you didn't, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Thanks for watching, and until next time, build something, make a mistake, and be safe.